Imagine the autumn of 1941. Across nearly all of Europe, the swastika flag flies high. France had fallen in 6 weeks, Poland in 3, Yugoslavia and Greece in mere days. Hitler had never lost. His army, the most powerful in history, seemed unstoppable. And now, on the horizon, Moscow. But for the Nazis, this wasn't just another dot on the map. This was a symbol. The capital of a country they saw as a colossus with feet of clay. The beating heart of Soviet power. The control center of a vast empire. These were the streets Lenin once walked. The offices where Stalin now ruled. The factories that forged weapons of war. The railroads that stitched the nation together from Vladivostok to Kiev. To Hitler, the capture of Moscow was meant to be the final nail in the Soviet coffin. He already envisioned the parade on Red Square, marching like a new Kaiser of the Third Reich. He even ordered granite stones shipped to Berlin for the future Victory Monument. That's how certain he was. Moscow would fall, quickly, effortlessly, like everything else before it. But this is where history took a sharp turn. Because Moscow wasn't just a capital city. It was the soul of a nation that refused but to die. It was millions of people who looked at the oncoming German tanks and said, "No, we will not surrender." It was the place where, for the first time, the Blitzkrieg machine began to break down. In this video, we'll walk the entire path, from the overconfident German plans to the desperate, yet brilliant Soviet defense. From panic and chaos to resilience and victory. Because the Battle of Moscow wasn't just a chapter in the war. It was the moment a single city became a symbol of unbreakable spirit. It was the moment the world heard, for the first time, the Nazis can be stopped. From the very beginning, Operation Barbarossa unfolded like clockwork. German panzers crushed everything in their path. Fields burned behind them, and endless columns of Soviet prisoners marched down the roads. To Hitler and his generals, it confirmed what they had believed all along. The Soviet Union was a house of cards, collapsing with the slightest push. Inside the Wehrmacht's high command, there was celebration. In early October 1941, at the very height of their confidence, Germany launched Operation Typhoon, the final push for Moscow, the supposed last fragile bastion. Commanders were so sure of victory that parade uniforms were ordered in advance for the triumphal march through Red Square. Columns were being organized to march beneath the Kremlin walls. Commemorative stones for German monuments in Moscow had already been selected and loaded onto trains. Victory felt like a matter of weeks, maybe even days. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, the man entrusted with taking the Soviet capital, spread out his maps with cold precision. He studied his flanking maneuvers. He charted the encirclement plans. He calculated every strike. Blitzkrieg had worked in France, in Poland, and across the wide-open steppes of the USSR. There was no reason to believe it wouldn't work again. The Germans understood one thing clearly. If Moscow fell, everything else would collapse. Without its central command, the vast Soviet machine would fall into chaos. Coordination between armies would disintegrate. Communication would break down. And most importantly, millions of Soviet citizens would lose all hope. The will to fight would disappear. But that's where the fatal mistake was made. They saw Moscow as a trophy, a city to be seized and displayed like a captured flag. But they didn't see the living organism that Moscow was, deeply rooted in its people, in its soil, in its history. They underestimated everything you can't measure on a map: resolve, desperation, historical memory, and an unmatched capacity for sacrifice. German generals assumed the Red Army would fold, as it had before, that Soviet soldiers were more afraid than determined, that Muscovites had no weapons, and certainly no spirit. But they were wrong, terribly wrong. They didn't know that while German tailors were stitching dress uniforms for a parade, in Siberia, hardened winter divisions were already being formed. Soldiers trained to fight in -30 degrees. That in Moscow, children were digging trenches alongside their grandmothers. That in the Kremlin sat a man they believed to be a coward, but who had already made his choice, not one step back. On paper, Operation Typhoon looked destined for success. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of tanks, air superiority, supply lines intact. Germany was preparing for a triumph, but none of them were prepared for the simple, brutal truth. Moscow would not bow its head. October 2nd, 1941. At dawn, the air was heavy, not with sound, but with the silence before a storm. Beyond the front lines in the west, 100,000 German trucks roared to life. Thousands of tanks aligned into massive columns. Warplanes took to the skies in formation. Operation Typhoon had begun. Hitler had issued a clear order: break through to Moscow, crush all resistance, and seize the Soviet capital before the first snowfall. This was to be the final blow, the hardest, fastest, and most decisive. The Wehrmacht, confident from its string of easy victories, believed it would all be over in weeks. The strategy looked elegant on paper. 3 massive strikes from the north, center, and south would squeeze a noose around Moscow. The Red Army would be either obliterated or forced to surrender. And in the early days, everything seemed to go exactly as planned. German tanks cut through Soviet defenses like butter. Entire Soviet armies at Vyazma and Bryansk were encircled. Over 500,000 troops were trapped. City after city fell: Orel, Kaluga, Mojaisk. Field Marshal von Bock's forces could almost see Moscow, close enough to feel it. It seemed just within reach, but the closer they got, the stranger the campaign became. Suddenly, the roads, once solid, began to disappear. Trucks sank into the mud. Tanks broke down. Perfectly planned logistics collided with a new enemy: the Russian autumn. Rains fell relentlessly. The fertile black soil turned to a thick, sticky mire. Wheels sunk up to their axles. Soldiers dragged machines by hand. Fuel was delayed. Communications faltered. And still ahead, the vast, silent fields and the unknown. And from that silence, the enemy began to stir. The Red Army, presumed crushed and scattered, started to fight back with the fury of the doomed. They didn't retreat. They clung to every village, every hill, every trench. Clad in worn-out coats, without winter gear, many with a single bullet for 2 men, they fought on. And it was here that the Germans first realized this wasn't a disorganized mob anymore. It was an army with new commanders, new tactics, and a new will. Every day of progress came at the cost of blood. Every kilometer, hundreds of lives. Field Marshal von Bock, leading Army Group Center, began to sense it. The plan was unraveling. His forces were overstretched. The flanks were thinning. The rear, under attack by partisans. Hope for a quick victory was melting, like tire tracks in the rain. But there was no time. Winter stood at the doorstep. Berlin demanded results. Everything now depended on one final push. Operation Typhoon lumbered forward like a wounded beast, still dangerous, but slowing, bleeding, exhausted. And ahead of it lay not a frightened city, but a capital that had already made peace with death and was ready to fight for life. October 15th, 1941. Moscow didn't wake up to alarm clocks that morning. It woke to the roar of engines and the quiet, rising murmur of panic. Chaos filled the streets. People abandoned their homes, clutching children and cramming belongings into carts, cars, and battered suitcases. Some cried, others shouted. No one knew the exact truth, but everyone felt it. The enemy was near. That day would later be remembered as Black Monday. Moscow trembled. Ministries were evacuated. Archives, priceless museum collections, national treasures, all rushed out of the capital. Masterpieces from the Tretyakov Gallery, gold reserves from state banks, factory equipment, loaded onto trains. Eastbound railways groaned under the weight of exodus. Some were sent to the Urals, others to Novosibirsk. Power was leaving, or so it seemed. Rumors spread like wildfire. The most terrifying one: Stalin has fled. People felt betrayed, abandoned, that it was all over. Looting began. Shops were ransacked. Law and order seemed to vanish. The city, once seen as impenetrable, now looked naked and exposed. But that was only the surface. While some packed their bags, others picked up shovels. Across the city, volunteers, students, workers, retirees began digging anti-tank trenches. Children worked beside their fathers. Women knitted warm clothes for the front. It was as if the earth beneath Moscow had risen to fight. And in the Kremlin, Stalin sat in silence. He had evacuation plans laid out. A personal train waited on reserve tracks. Everything was ready for his departure. But then, in a moment that would echo through history, he placed his hand on the map and said, "I will stay." That decision wasn't just symbolic. It was a signal that traveled from ministries to military fronts to the frightened streets. The leader had not left, so neither would Moscow. 2 days later, on October 17th, Stalin issued an uncompromising order: restore order in the capital at any cost. Panic mongers were to be shot. Looters hanged on the spot. Retreat no longer an option. Moscow would be defended. And from that moment, a new Moscow began to emerge. Not the city that cried, but the one that worked. The subway became a bomb shelter. Theaters and schools, field hospitals, factories, makeshift weapons labs. Everything, everyone, was repurposed toward one goal: keep the enemy away from the Kremlin's walls. And the closer the German tanks crept, the tighter the fist of resistance clenched. Moscow stopped being just a city. It became a fortress, a people's fortress, alive, stubborn, unbreakable. In those weeks, when everything could have fallen apart, something entirely different happened. Something was born, something that would later be called the backbone of victory. Because when the capital says, "I will stay," the entire country begins to believe it can win. December 1941. Outside Moscow, hell has frozen over. Temperatures plummet below -30 degrees. The wind slices skin like a blade. German soldiers, still in summer uniforms, shiver uncontrollably. Their machines won't start. Lubricants freeze in gun barrels. Fuel thickens. Engines crack and fail. The once invincible army of the Third Reich now trembles, not just from cold, but from fear. They had made it to the outskirts. They could see the domes of distant monasteries, hear the distant thunder of Moscow's cannons. The Kremlin was less than 30 kilometers away, but every step forward was harder than the last. Not just because of snow, but because of something else stirring in the forests. Something ancient, something fierce. From Siberia, fresh Soviet divisions arrived, hardened by brutal winters. Dressed in white camouflage, they blended with the snow. Ghosts of the frost. Stalin, having learned from his spies that Japan would not strike from the east, made a bold move. He stripped troops from the Far East and hurled them into the defense of Moscow. These weren't just soldiers, they were winter warriors. They came equipped, fur coats, skis, rifles greased for the cold. They came prepared where the Germans were collapsing. December 5th, under the cover of an icy night, the Red Army launched its counteroffensive. Not cautious, not reserved, but like a sledgehammer. First, the roar of artillery. Then, wave after wave of infantry. Tanks, Katyusha rockets screaming overhead. And in every charge, a desperate, unstoppable resolve. Not just to defend Moscow, but to prove that the enemy could be stopped. The German front began to crack. They hadn't expected this. Their intelligence had failed. They didn't know how many reinforcements were now at the capital's gates. They didn't believe the Red Army was even capable of a major offensive. Now, they were retreating, in haste, abandoning vehicles, wounded men, even weapons. And something new was born in those snow-covered fields. If before, the Soviet soldier fought because he was ordered to, now, he fought because he believed. The front line no longer bent in fear. It surged forward with purpose. They saw the enemy could bleed, could fall, could run. At the center of it all was General Zhukov, the quiet strategist holding Moscow in his iron grip. He struck not head-on, but with precision. Flanks, weak points, supply lines. He didn't waste men. He wore the enemy down. This wasn't just a battle, it was a lesson in command. The counteroffensive spread. Volokholamsk, Kalinin, Klin, German losses mounted. For the first time in the war, Hitler's army gave up ground and paid for it in thousands of lives. Tanks rolled down frozen roads, but now they rolled in reverse. The winter the Nazis had feared became Moscow's greatest ally. General Frost fought for the Soviets, but even more powerful was the arrival of General Hope. The Red Army had found belief in itself, and in that belief, the great turning point of the war had begun. While shells exploded and rifles cracked on the front lines, another battle raged in the heart of Moscow. A silent battle, one without generals, tanks, or medals. A battle fought by teachers, doctors, writers, factory workers, elderly grandparents, and children. The city was under siege, but not in panic. It came alive with a new rhythm, the rhythm of survival and resistance. When it became clear that the enemy was near, thousands of Muscovites took to the streets, not with protests, but with shovels. Even school children dug trenches, along highways, in yards, in empty lots. They built anti-tank ditches, planted steel obstacles, dug defensive positions. Rumors whispered that tanks were just beyond the hills, but no one waited to be saved. They built their own salvation by hand. In the factories, machines never stopped. The city worked without sleep. Women replaced husbands who had gone to war, standing at lathes and welding stations. Teenagers assembled ammunition. Hospitals cleared entire floors in preparation for incoming wounded. Theaters closed, but actors didn't rest. They performed in field hospitals, lifting spirits. Even full orchestras played on frozen streets, performing Shostakovich in sub-zero winds so people would remember. Moscow was still alive. And then there was darkness. To hide from enemy bombers, the city went dark. Street lamps switched off. Windows were taped and covered. But beneath that blacked-out veil, the city hummed with purpose. Families slept in subway stations, in school basements, in converted shelters. And every morning, they got up and went to work, as if there were no war, as if it were all still normal. They weren't soldiers, but they were fighters. Every Muscovite became part of the defense. Someone cooked soup for hospitals. Someone drove trains full of wounded evacuees. Someone simply stayed when they could have fled. And that, too, was an act of war. There were dark days. October 15th, chaos erupted. Public transport stopped. Shops were looted. Panic spread. Rumors claimed Stalin had fled. But by the third day, the city found its spine. A voice on the radio declared, "We will not leave." And fear turned into defiance. The city did not fall. It did not surrender. Because it had a shield. Its people. People who didn't know how to shoot, but knew how to believe. Who held on not out of fear, but out of love. For their city, for their families, for their memory. When the Germans finally retreated, there were no ringing bells in Moscow. There were too many tears for that. But every citizen knew their sacrifice mattered. That the dim lights behind curtains, the freezing nights in shelters, the trenches dug by hand, had held the line. Moscow stood, not just because of its soldiers, but because of every soul who said, "I will stay. This is my city. This is my war." November 1941. The snow hasn't stopped in 4 days. Shells explode on the city's outskirts, but inside Moscow, there is silence. Frozen, tense. People huddle around radios as if they expect something more than news. They wait for a sign, and it comes. November 7th, the anniversary of the October Revolution. There's going to be a military parade in Moscow, on Red Square. Yes, in the middle of a siege. While the enemy stands less than 30 kilometers from the Kremlin, under gray skies, Soviet troops march past Lenin's mausoleum, and straight from that parade, they'll head into battle. The world watches in disbelief. A parade during a siege? This isn't just a symbol, it's a challenge. It's a psychological weapon. We are not afraid. We are here. And we will fight. That's what every synchronized step, every soldier's boot hitting the cobblestones of Red Square, shouts to the world. Stalin steps up to the granite podium. He doesn't smile. His voice is slow, cold. Every syllable feels like a hammer. He doesn't promise easy victories. He simply says, "The enemy will be crushed. Victory will be ours." And in that moment, across the vast Soviet land, from Moscow to Vladivostok, people stand a little taller. They feel it in their bones. The country isn't collapsing, it's rising. Meanwhile, on the other side of the front, things look very different. German soldiers freeze under snowstorms. Their uniforms are thin. Fingers turn blue. Engines lock up. But it's not just the cold that breaks them. It's something deeper. They realize they're not facing a weak enemy. They're facing fanatical resistance. They were promised a swift victory. Instead, they meet a capital city that holds parades under air raid sirens. A city that doesn't flee. A people that refuse to bend. For the first time, Wehrmacht soldiers begin to ask, can Moscow even be taken? Exhaustion, hunger, frostbite, those are bearable. But the collapse of faith is not. Letters home grow darker. Desertions increase. Commanders raise the alarm. Morale is broken. On the Soviet side, it's the opposite. The parade, once seen as a desperate act, becomes a turning point, a symbol, a message. Moscow is alive, and it will be defended to the last drop of blood. Psychological warfare is the quietest battlefield, but the most dangerous. It's fought not in trenches, but in minds. And in November 1941, the victors were not those with more tanks, but those with more resolve to stay, to fight, and to never, ever give in. The night of December 4th, 1941, near Moscow. The wind slices through skin. The cold burns in every breath. Minus 30 degrees Celsius. German soldiers lie awake, wrapped in summer coats. Not because they're on guard, but because it's impossible to sleep. They're shaking from cold, from fear, from the unknown. They've reached their breaking point. Meanwhile, behind the front lines, silence breaks with a single command. Forward. Something begins that Hitler never expected. Something he wasn't prepared for. The Soviet counteroffensive. December 5th. A date that would later be remembered as the beginning of the end for Germany's Operation Typhoon. Marshal Georgy Zhukov gives the order for a massive attack. Fresh troops roll to the front, Siberian divisions, hardened in Arctic warfare. These aren't survivors from earlier battles. They're rested, trained, and fully equipped, covered in fur, steel, and cold-born determination. Winter isn't their enemy, it's their natural element. For the German army, it's a shock. They're used to advancing. Now they're retreating. In panic, in chaos, waist-deep in snow, abandoning tanks, guns, wounded comrades. Where yesterday they saw victory, today they see collapse. Soviet forces, fueled by their first chance not just to hold the line, but to push forward, fight with fierce determination. Blows fall across multiple fronts. German units are surrounded. Some surrender. Some fall. Some desert. Back in Moscow, the mood changes. There are no cheers, not yet. But there is joy. Quiet, cautious, but real. People listen to radio reports that don't talk about holding positions, but about breaking through. Newspapers print the headline, "Enemy pushed back 100 kilometers." These aren't just numbers, they are hope. Hope the city hasn't known since the war began. Hitler rages. He fires generals, blames everyone. But it's too late. For the first time in the war, the German army loses initiative. Their greatest weapons, speed, surprise, relentless pressure, are gone. In their place, a grinding, freezing nightmare they can't outpace. What was supposed to be a lightning conquest turns into a slow, brutal retreat through snow and resistance that refuses to break. December 5th marks a shift, not just for Moscow, but for the entire war. Here, in frozen forests and icy plains, the clock begins ticking, counting down for the Third Reich. History turned here, not because one side had more soldiers, but because one side had more will to endure, more readiness to fight not for glory, but for survival. From this day forward, the Germans never march on Moscow again. From this day, they begin their long road back. January 1942. The Moscow winter hasn't loosened its grip, but the air feels different. It's not just cold now, it's the silence after a storm. The Germans have been pushed back. The Red Army holds the line. Moscow has endured. But behind that word, endured, lies something far greater than a city's defense. For Hitler, this wasn't just a tactical failure. It was his first real blow. Until Moscow, the Nazi war machine had rolled over Europe like thunder. France had fallen in 6 weeks. Poland, in days. Even capital cities collapsed like paper under the Blitzkrieg. But Moscow didn't fall. And that changed everything. It wasn't just a military miscalculation. It was a strike at the heart of the myth of Nazi invincibility. For the first time, the world saw the fascist war machine can falter, it can bleed, it can lose. That message echoed everywhere. In Germany, quiet whispers began. Maybe this war won't be over quickly. In London and Washington, leaders took note. The Soviet Union isn't just surviving, it's striking back. It affected diplomacy. It accelerated the Lend-Lease program. It laid the groundwork for future alliances. For the Soviet people, the Battle of Moscow wasn't just a spark of hope. It was proof. Proof that resistance wasn't futile. That despite the retreats, the bombings, the deaths, the enemy could be stopped. And if it could be stopped, it could be defeated. The moral turning point was enormous. Moscow became a symbol of endurance. Just as Stalingrad would later symbolize resolve, Kursk would embody strength, and Berlin would mark the end. From a military standpoint, the battle shattered the Blitzkrieg strategy. Germany had planned to seize the Soviet capital before winter, crush its main forces, and force a surrender. It failed. Instead, they faced a drawn-out, grinding war on 2 fronts, a mistake made by many invaders before them, from Napoleon to Hitler. Moscow didn't just change the course of the war, it changed the faith in its outcome. The belief that even in the face of the most powerful enemy, even while standing on the edge of ruin, you can endure. And not just endure, but begin the long, bloody road toward victory.